In July 2026, something strange happened. An 8-year-old game climbed back onto the Steam charts, and it wasn't because of a remaster, a sale, or a surprise sequel announcement. It was because of a movie theater. Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey hit cinemas, and within 10 days, the daily active player count on Assassin's Creed Odyssey nearly doubled across PC and console. People weren't just curious about ancient Greece anymore, they wanted to live in it. And the game they picked wasn't Origins, it wasn't Valhalla. It was the one game in this franchise that critics loved, hardcore fans hated, and everyone argued about for years. That's the game we're talking about today. Not because it's trendy right now, though it is, but because I think it's been misjudged since the day it launched, and it's time somebody said that out loud with the full case laid out. This is why Assassin's Creed Odyssey deserves more respect than it's ever gotten.
Let's not pretend the criticism came from nowhere. When Odyssey launched in October 2018, a huge chunk of the fanbase was furious. And I want to actually explain why instead of brushing past it, because the reasons matter. For over a decade, Assassin's Creed meant one thing: a hooded assassin, a hidden blade, stealth-first gameplay, and a modern-day conspiracy running underneath it all. Odyssey took a mercenary, a Misthios, stripped away most of that stealth identity, and dropped in loop drops, gear rarity, level gate quests, and dialogue trees straight out of a Western RPG. Longtime fans weren't just annoyed by new mechanics, they felt like the thing they loved had been replaced with something wearing its name. And they had a real point. If you came to the series for tight, methodical stealth kills where one wrong move meant restarting, Odyssey's forgiving combat and spongy enemies at higher levels genuinely worked against that. The story also splits its focus between a personal family saga and a wider Issa mythology, and depending on who you ask, that balance doesn't always land. I'm not here to tell you those criticisms were invented. They weren't. But here's the thing about first impressions. They freeze a game in amber at launch, and Odyssey in October 2018 is not the same experience as Odyssey today. Most games don't get a second chance to be judged fairly. This one is getting one right now, in real time, and it's worth understanding why.
Strip away every mechanical complaint for a second and talk about the one thing almost nobody disputes, even the harshest critics. Ubisoft Quebec built one of the most complete recreations of an ancient world ever put into a video game. This isn't a handful of famous landmarks stitched together with filler terrain, it's the Peloponnesian War recreated at a scale that still doesn't have a real competitor. Athens under Pericles, Sparta's brutal military culture, the islands of the Aegean, each with their own economy, their own politics, their own reasons to hate or need each other. You can sail into a naval blockade between two city-states and realize the game expects you to understand why they're fighting, not just who to stab. And in 2026, running on modern SSDs and current-gen hardware, the load times that used to interrupt that immersion are essentially gone. What used to be a 15-second loading screen between islands is now nearly instant. The world design that was already praised in 2018 is now experienced the way it was probably meant to be experienced from the start, uninterrupted. This is also, and I'd argue this doesn't get said enough, one of the best pieces of historical education disguised as entertainment that gaming has ever produced. People are revisiting this game right now specifically because a Hollywood blockbuster reminded them Greek mythology is fascinating, and Odyssey has been sitting there for 8 years, ready to let you actually walk through it.
You can give players a choice between two protagonists and have it barely matter. Odyssey didn't do that. Melisanthe Mahout's performance as Cassandra earned a BAFTA Games Award nomination and recognition at the Game Awards for a character that, on paper, was almost cut from the marketing entirely. Ubisoft's own internal lore eventually confirmed what most players already knew from playing her. Cassandra is the canon Eaglebearer. She's not the alternate choice. She's the character this story was actually written for. What made her land wasn't just the writing, it was that she never felt like a reskinned male character with a different voice bolted on. Her humor, her weariness, the way she processes losing her family across 400 hours of side content, it's specific to her. That's rare in an industry that historically treated female leads as an optional toggle rather than a fully realized choice.
If you play it as Alexios first and never gave Cassandra a shot, that's genuinely the single biggest thing I tell you to go back and fix. The reappraisal happening across this fanbase right now isn't really about mechanics. It's people rediscovering that this character was one of the strongest protagonists this franchise has ever written, and she got buried under launch discourse about loot tiers.
Here's where I'll push back on the mechanical criticism directly, because I don't think it holds up as well in hindsight as people remember it. Odyssey gave you exploration mode, which removed quest markers entirely and made you actually read NPC dialogue and look at the landscape to figure out where to go. That's a mode most open-world games still don't bother offering. It respected the player enough to let them get a little lost. The DLC additions extended that respect. Legacy of the First Blade gave the world an actual antagonist organization with personal stakes tied to Cassandra's own bloodline. The fate of Atlantis took the entire endgame somewhere genuinely strange, into a mythological afterlife arc that most action RPGs would never risk attempting. And bundled alongside all of that, remastered versions of Assassin's Creed 3 and Assassin's Creed Liberation came along for free with the Season Pass, which is a level of post-launch value that a lot of games charging full price today still don't match. Combat also got real attention over time. A patch brought a stable 60 frames per second to consoles, tightening up something that felt sluggish at launch. People who bounced off the game in its first few months because of bugs or performance issues are, by nearly every account revisiting it now, met with a noticeably smoother experience. This is a game Ubisoft kept improving long after most studios would have moved on to the next release. And in terms of sheer scale, this is a 100+ hour game if you're doing the DLC and side content properly. That used to get framed as bloat. In 2026, when players are actively hungry for something they can sink months into, that same length reads less like padding and more like value. I want to back up the reappraisal claim with actual numbers, because I think it's easy to dismiss this as a handful of loud opinions online. Analytics firms tracking player activity across Steam, PlayStation, and Xbox recorded combined daily active users jumping from around 122,000 on the opening day of Nolan's film to 233,000 just 10 days later, a rise of roughly 90%. On Steam specifically, concurrent players climbed from a baseline of 3,500 to 4,500 up to a peak past 8,500. For context, this game's all-time launch peak back in 2018 was just over 62,000, so a nearly 8-year-old title was pulling in numbers close to a meaningful fraction of its original launch week, driven almost entirely by word of mouth and a completely unrelated film. And this didn't start with the movie either. Analysts had already noted a broader critical reevaluation building since the release of Assassin's Creed Shadows, as fans started comparing the newer entries back against Odyssey, and in a lot of cases, deciding Odyssey aged better. Academic circles have taken notice too. There's an entire scholarly collection currently being assembled specifically to examine Odyssey's legacy, impact, and influence on the genre almost a decade later. That's not nostalgia. Nostalgia is looking back fondly at something because of when you experienced it. This is people replaying the actual game today on modern hardware with modern expectations and concluding it holds up. Some for the first time, some going back to it after years away and being surprised by how much better it feels than they remembered.
Here's why I think this actually matters beyond just one game getting a nostalgia bump. Odyssey took the biggest risk this franchise had taken in a decade. It bet that players would accept a completely different genre wearing a familiar name, and it got punished for that ambition immediately by the exact community that claims it wants franchises to evolve instead of repeating themselves. That's a pattern that happens constantly in gaming. The safe sequel gets praised for competence, the ambitious swing gets torn apart for not being the thing people expected, and only years later does it get credit for being the thing it actually was. Odyssey didn't need a remaster to prove itself. It didn't need a sequel to vindicate it. It just needed enough time and enough people willing to actually finish it instead of judging it off week one impressions for the reputation to catch up to the quality that was sitting there the entire time.
So if you played this back in 2018, got frustrated by the loot system or the grind, and shelved it, I'm telling you, the game you'd be playing today is a meaningfully better version of the one you quit. The world is still the best ancient setting this medium has ever produced. Cassandra is still one of the best performed characters this franchise has ever had, and the numbers right now prove I'm not the only one saying it. Assassin's Creed Odyssey didn't need to be rescued, it just needed people to stop judging it by its